Hi, welcome to Dead Air Live. My name's Denise Taylor, and I'll be hosting this evening's show. Our guest tonight is respected historian and writer Howard Zinn. He has filled many roles throughout his long career. He has been an author, an educator, an activist, and an artist. He has written numerous books and essays on political and social issues. He's currently a professor emeritus in government at Boston University. He's been a longtime activist. He's greatly involved in the civil rights and peace movements. And he also is an accomplished playwright. And a lot of the work he's done has focused on encouraging an alternative viewpoint and critical thinking about issues that impact on our lives. And that's what he's here to do with us tonight. The issue we're going to be talking about is the current trend to scale back the responsibilities, powers, and services of the federal government. So let me welcome you to the show and start by asking you if you could talk about what's happening right now and why this is important.
Well, what's happening right now, as is evident in just reading the news stories every day and watching television, is that the recent election, in which the Republicans won so many more seats in Congress, has led the Republicans into a kind of frenzy of confidence that now they can make very drastic changes in what has been taking place in the United States since the 1930s, and that is the programs that help the poor, that help women, that help children, that help old people, health, Social Security, unemployment insurance, benefits for mothers who have to take care of children. They see this, the Republicans, having won this election, have transformed what really is a minuscule victory into some sort of grand revolutionary change. I must say that they've been really joined in this by the Democratic Party, which has sort of humbly and very submissively accepted the fact that this puny victory, as I say, 37, 38% of the population going to the polls, slightly more than half of them voting for the Republicans, this puny victory is transformed into what is called a mandate, so much so that President Clinton feels obliged to say, well, the people have spoken, and I must listen. Well, a very small portion of the people spoke, and their speaking took place in the context of a very limited choice between Republicans and Democrats and nobody else. So both Democrats going along with this idea of a mandate, the Republicans trumpeting it, and the media cooperating. The media, of course, are great at exaggerating narrow victories into landslides. They did this when Reagan was elected. They transformed what really were very modest victories by Reagan and Republicans into landslide victories for Reagan, when actually half the population wasn't voting. And Reagan was becoming president by dint of the fact that 29 or 30 or at the most 32% of the voting population were voting for Reagan. Mm-hmm. This translated by the media into overwhelming victory. And what that does then is to create the impression is this is what the people want. This is what the American people prefer. When actually, going back again to Reagan, because this has been a persistent thing in American history, the surveys of public opinion showed that on the major issues, most Americans disagreed with Reagan. just as today, and this is, I think, very important for understanding what is going on today. What is going on today is that a profoundly undemocratic consensus has developed between the Republican and Democratic parties. I say undemocratic because all of the surveys of public opinion that have taken place since the mid-1980s, from then until last year, show that on the major issues, the public has very different views than either the Republican or the Democratic Party. And the views that the public has do not at all correspond to the idea that we should have rollbacks in Social Security or aid to mothers with dependent children, or education or health, Medicare. Not at all. And so the Republican and Democratic parties are really ignoring what people want and proceeding with their own agenda.
So if this is only what a portion of the voting population wants, then who is it that wants what's happening in Congress right now? Who
Well, in order
benefits?
to, I guess, in order to answer the question of who wants this, you'd have to ask the question, who are the interests represented by the Democratic and Republican parties? And I think the answer is, we've known for some time, it's been sort of established in American politics, that the Republican Party represents the wealthiest sections of the population, represents Wall Street and financiers and corporate wealth. But for a long time, there was the illusion created that the Democratic Party was very different. That the Democratic Party was the party of the small man, woman. Woman was secondary, of course. But the Democratic Party was the party of the working man, of the lower middle class person, and even of black people and the ethnic groups. This is, I suppose, a view of the Democratic Party that came out of the New Deal period, when the strong reforms of the Roosevelt administration and the Depression did in fact give help to the lower classes of the population. And an idea reinforced by the 1960s and the period of Lyndon Johnson, when Medicaid, Medicare, and when the Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs were put into effect to help at least a number of people at the lower income levels. But in fact, the Democratic Party has always been a party dominated by wealthy interests. Even if you go back to that period when the Democratic Party was closest to being a populist party, that is the period of the 1930s and FDR and the New Deal. Even at that time, the wealthy classes were really divided between Republicans and Democrats, and there were many wealthy interests that supported the Democratic Party and supported the reforms, and they supported the reforms because they were afraid of something more radical, more far-reaching. And this is a constant in American history, and that is reforms promulgated by the national government, supported by important elements of the corporate classes and of industry, supported for the reason that they are afraid that if these reforms are not put into effect, people will demand much more drastic changes in the economic and social system. I mean, you can carry this back, if you don't mind my doing a little history, okay? You can carry this back to, well, the Grover Cleveland administration. I know people will say, Grover Cleveland, who is he? Who was he? I mean, we know who Madonna is, but who is Grover Cleveland? No, but he was a president of the United States. And in the 1880s, when Grover Cleveland was president, there began what is probably the first of a series of regulatory acts passed by Congress, which became law. The Interstate Commerce Act, which was an act to regulate, well, railroads, and based on the Interstate Commerce Clause of the Constitution. Now, and farmers had been creating a great popular movement, Farmers' Alliances, the Populist Party, the People's Party, a great national movement protesting against railroad rates, protesting against the high prices charged to farmers and so on. And they were a formidable force in the 1880s and 1890s. Well, in response to this, the Interstate Commerce Act was passed to say to the farmers, you see, we're regulating the railroads. But in fact, Richard Olney, who was a lawyer for the railroads, wrote at the time to the railroad interests who were worried about being regulated. And he said to them, I don't have his letter with me, so I have to paraphrase it. and Richard Olney is not here to contradict me. So he said to the railroad interests, don't worry, it's no big deal. This will soothe and satisfy those people who would demand radical changes in the economic structure. And it really won't be enforced very much. Well, this pattern is a historic pattern, and that is reforms passed, which, now some of them are helpful, and some of them are useful, and better enforced than the Interstate Commerce Act, you know, like the Social Security system. And yes, they are real and they help people, but very often they are supported also by the wealthy classes, or by part of the wealthy classes. Part of the wealthy classes is very selfish and short-sighted. They don't want to give anything. There's another part of the wealthy classes which says, oh, let's give a little in order that we don't lose more. But the point I'm making is that both Democrats and Republicans have always been closer to the corporate interests of the country, to the industrial giants and financial magnates of the country, than they have been to the common people. The difference between them has been that the Democratic Party represents that section of the corporate interest that is more willing years. And by that I mean that since the New Deal and since the year 60s, the Great Society, the Democratic Party has been more and more dominated by corporate interests. The last two Democratic presidents, that is Carter and Clinton, show this, you know, very, very clearly in the appointments they make and in the policies they follow. And with Clinton, we find that the campaign contributions given by corporations, where the pattern used to be that you would find much, much greater corporate financing of the Republican Party than of the Democratic Party, now they're virtually equal. You find corporate financing of both parties roughly equal. The corporations are playing their cards on both sides on the supposition that whoever wins the election, they win. And so it's not, when you ask, you know, who is going to benefit by this? Now, if they cut Medicaid and Medicare, and if they cut programs that help the poor, and if they then cut taxes, which, you know, they will inevitably do, they will cut taxes on the upper portion of the population, on the high-income people. And in effect, they will be taking money from social programs and giving it to the upper 1% of the population. Now, this was exactly what Reagan tried to do. He didn't totally succeed, but he moved in that direction. He succeeded in one part of that program, and that is in what was called, very euphemistically, tax reform. And the tax reform of the Reagan years, although I must put a little parenthetical remark in here, the tax reform which really started in 1978, while Carter was president, in which Carter approved, and underlining my point that there isn't that much difference between the Republican and Democratic parties when it comes to favoring the rich, started in the Carter administration, but then carried full scale in the Reagan administration. Tax reform took roughly 70 or 80 billion dollars a year out of the national treasury and gave it in tax benefits to the upper 1% of the population. The result of this was that after 13 years or so, that is from 1978 to 1990, 1991, the upper 1% of the population, which before this had possessed about $4 trillion worth of wealth, slightly more than you and I can imagine, but now possess not $4 trillion worth after 13 years of tax reform, but $5 trillion. In other words, $1 trillion of national wealth was funneled into the upper 1% of the population. Obviously, they don't think that's enough. They're suffering. They're in terrible shape. They need more. And so their constituents, meaning corporate interests, are demanding more. And so they're rushing to cut social programs and rushing at the same time to try to persuade the American public that this is the right thing to do.
So why is this happening now? Why do they feel comfortable to make this change now?
Well, I think they feel comfortable to make this change because one, they won, as I say, this very narrow election, but because they have succeeded, when I say they, I mean both Democratic and Republicans, have succeeded over the years with the collaboration of the media in persuading the American public that elections tell the story. That is, that if a party is voted into power, therefore it means that the people support the policies of that party. Now, the evidence doesn't run that way. As I said, the evidence of what people say in public opinion polls is not what parties want. But this illusion is created that an electoral victory means a mandate. So they think that with this narrow victory that they had last year, that they can put over this program before anybody can realize what is happening. Just as during the Reagan years, they put over this tax reform, and by calling it tax reform, people were not aware of what was happening. Another reason I suppose they think they can do it at this time is that the media have been more and more controlled by upper-class interests. And you find, well, you know that television is dominated by these huge conglomerates, CBS and NBC and ABC, which in turn are tied to industrial conglomerates, which own not only television stations but newspapers and industries, GE and GM and IT and T and so and the radio industry, more and more dominated by talk shows financed by the right wing and by and the crowding out of the media, crowding out of small stations, sure, there's cable television, but cable television simply does not have the resources to reach as many people as NBC and ABC and CBS and so on. So the increasing monopolization of the media, I think, is another factor which enables them to think, well, we can do this now and get away with it. Now, I don't think they will. This is I don't like to make prophecies.
Get away with it.
By get away with it, I mean get away with cutting back on things that people desperately need. Education, housing, Medicare, Medicaid, and aid to women with dependent children, free lunches for kids, fuel assistance. I mean, all of these things, all of these programs for the poor being cut back. I don't think they'll get away with it, because I think that while with tax reform, you can play with numbers, you know, you can sort of with smoke and mirrors, and people don't really know what's going on. People are not accountants, and the media doesn't help them become accountants, because the media doesn't really tell them. They'd have to go to the library and read books, particularly on the subject, you know, they'd have to read William Greider's book, you know, Who Will Tell the People, you know, but that's only a small portion of the reading public. And so with taxes they can do it, I think. But when people feel the sting of cuts in help for children, in help for the kids going to school, in Medicaid and Medicare, and the elderly population is a growing population in this country, and they have their own lobbies and a strong voice. I think there's going to be a rebellion of some sort against what is going on. Well, I hope there will be, and I guess I think that there's a point at which elites go too far in their greed, and when they go too far, they engender rebellion, and you know, they created an economic crisis. In the 1920s, which is a period which in some ways is comparable, that is a period when great tax benefits were given to the rich under President Calvin Coolidge and Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon, and a period in which Wall Street was doing very well, but there was a lot of unemployment and poverty in the country, and it all came down in a crash, and the result was revolt all over the country. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I don't know exactly what will happen. I don't know what the scenario will be, but my hope is, and maybe my prediction is, that there's a point beyond which they cannot make people in this country in need suffer, and there's a point beyond which even people who are not suffering, there's middle-class Americans who will not suffer as much as single mothers taking care of children. Well, middle-class Americans will look around and say, you know, this is not right. There are too many homeless people, and there's too much crime, because the more programs are cut, the more desperation will be, the more crime there will be, the more jails they will want to build, and the more our society will have a look that it already has, but a look which can get worse, the look of a culture in decay.
I'd like to go back to the media again, though,
Yeah.
and ask if perhaps the interests that are behind these changes aren't preparing in another way to deal with the response in terms of media deregulation, which is going to allow even greater control of information markets.
Yeah, that's an interesting and important point, media deregulation. And it started, if you can talk about a starting point, I think it started in the Reagan administration, when Reagan did away with the fairness doctrine. And you know, the fairness doctrine at least gave opportunity for dissident views to be aired on TV, created some limits, didn't of course really create equal access, but it allowed more access to dissident views than we have today. And the end of the fairness doctrine, I think, is responsible to a large extent for bringing about a situation today where the media become more and more one voice. I mean, you turn on the three major networks and you get the same news stories told from the same point of view. In fact, you turn on public television, McNeil era, and you very often get the same news stories and a point of view not very much different. A very narrow band of opinion. So the deregulation of television, of cable, I think is all intended to bring about what we always said was true of totalitarian states. So, Big Brother, a single voice, a single opinion dominating our culture. And we could hardly imagine anything more undemocratic than that. Because, if democracy needs anything, I can't imagine anything that democracy needs more than an informed public. And the public has never been well informed by the media, and the way things are going, it will be even less informed.
Where should the public go now to get informed? Where can the public go now to get informed?
Well, it's a good question. It's hard. Where do I go to get informed? I have to go beyond CBS and NBC. And, it can go to community radio stations. It can go to alternative newspapers. None of these have enormous publics. But in fact, there are alternative newspapers all over this country today, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of alternative newspapers, which did not exist even in what was supposed to be the heyday of social action, protest, that is the 1960s. I travel around the country a lot and speak here and there, and wherever I go, however small the town, there's an alternative newspaper. So people, that's one possible source. Alternative papers, alternative radio, perhaps 200 community radio stations around the country. During the Gulf War, for instance, the only place on either television or radio where you could get an analysis of what was going on, something other than generals and congressmen, and shots of smart bombs falling, presumably on military targets. The only place we could get an alternative analysis of the Gulf War was by listening to alternative radio stations. And of course, not enough people listened to that, and so 90% at one point of the public supported the Gulf War because they were getting one viewpoint. The people are not dumb, but people can be misled if they don't have the information. Now, of course, another thing that people can do is go to the library. That's a very old-fashioned thing. But books, libraries are probably the freest marketplace of ideas we have. And you can find out things in books that you will certainly not find in newspapers or on television or radio. If you want to learn about American foreign policy, you have to read Noam Chomsky. And if you want to read about what's going on in Latin America or the Middle East or Africa, you have to look for books to express different points of view and give you different information. There are little journals, little newspapers. You can read The Nation, which is an alternative, liberal, occasionally radical point of view. There's The Progressive, which comes out of Wisconsin. There's Mother Jones on the West Coast. There's In These Times, which is sort of a weekly socialist newspaper. And I understand that there are newsletters that are sent out by organizations. The green organizations in various parts of this country have newsletters, I think, which they send out and which give you environmental information which you can't get anywhere else. The truth is, in order to get information, you really have to work at it. It's not easy. In order to get alternative views, you have to really struggle to find sources of information other than the government and other than the major media.
So do you think the Republicans really believe that the media is too liberal, or is the campaign
Well,
strategy?
I guess you might say it's always too liberal for them, no matter how illiberal it is. And I suppose they can, I know it seems absurd to say that the press is too liberal because, you know, the press goes along with the American political tradition represented by the Republican and Democratic parties. But any degree of liberalism is too much for them. And so, and they assume that the more they cry that the press is too liberal, that the 92% of control that they have, well, will grow to 95%. Even the smallest of dissident voices bother them. If Molly Ivins writes an op-ed piece which appears in 100 newspapers around the country and expresses a dissident view on President Clinton's bombing of Baghdad 6 months after he came into office, you know, all the newspapers, all the major media around the country, they didn't criticize it. And they didn't criticize what really amounted to a kind of act of terrorism by a government, right? You know, bombing a neighborhood in order to make a point, which is what terrorism does, you know, killing innocent people in order to make some political statement. Molly Ivins wrote an op-ed piece in which she called it terrorism. Now, that was one of those rare instances where in the major media, the Boston Globe, maybe 100 other newspapers around the country, one column says something that nobody else says. You know, the emperor has no clothes. Well, that's too much for them. The media is too liberal. They want to squelch that too. They want 100% control. I mean, you know, it's like it's the right-wing attack on the arts. You know, they talk the arts are, you know, are presenting revolutionary and radical and pornographic ideas. You know. They want really total control of the arts, or the universities. They just as they say, well, you know, the press is too liberal. They've actually written books in which they say universities are dominated by Marxists. Well, they must be talking about another country. They're not talking about the United States of America. But this is a very common tactic to kind of create a scare, to create a little hysteria in order to win a little more control.
So basically what you're saying is what's happening now is we have people who are telling us that they're going to free us from big government. At the same time, they're actually gathering up more control.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. Well, that's exactly true. It's interesting that this talk about big government, it's almost laughable if you just know a little bit of American history, because the Republicans want big government. They want big government when it does what they want it to do. They certainly want big government when they make war. They don't want to give war over to private enterprise. They don't want to privatize the military. No. They don't like big government when government does something for ordinary people or poor people. They like government when government does something like create an oil depletion allowance for the rich or change the tax structure. That's when they like government. This country was founded on big government, you know, and it was the very formation of the Constitution took place because the founding fathers did not like the idea of a decentralized system with a weak central government. They wanted a strong central government, and they wanted big government for the same reason that the upper classes have always wanted big government. They wanted big government because big government has always been a protector of the interests of the rich. And they wanted a constitution with a strong central government to protect the interests of the slaveholders and the bondholders and the landholders and the merchants and the manufacturers, because only a strong central government could do that. And in the 19th century, we had big government in the sense that the government gave huge grants of land to the railroads. 100 million acres of land were given free to the railroads. Now, if you ask the government, if you were poor today, and asked the government for an acre of land, 1 acre of land, as a gift, because you're poor, I mean, you would be laughed at. Now, they gave huge grants of land to the railroads, huge subsidies to the merchant marine, great, the manufacturers needed big government to set tariffs so that the manufacturers could raise their prices to people here and so they could make more money. All through the 19th century, we had big government on the side of the rich. We had a welfare state which gave the greatest amount of welfare to railroads and banks and steel corporations and merchant marine fleets and so on. Then, in the 20th century, for the first time, government begins, under the pressure of socialists, populists, progressives, labor unions, strikes, in the early part of the century, the 1930s, the movements of the 1960s. In the 20th century, the government begins to give benefits to the poor, the New Deal measures and the Fair Deal measures and so on. And then the cry arises, big government, welfare. So it requires an obliteration of history in order for them to put over on the American public the idea that big government is not good. And I might say this, although they are trying very, very hard to create a national consensus around the idea that big government is no good, and therefore the federal government must not give so much money to people who need it, their campaign really has not succeeded. That is, the surveys still show that most Americans want the government to help people who are in need. Now, they've carried on an immense public relations, do something about the welfare system, and it makes people lazy. They don't work as if, well, you know. But